Dr. Sohom Das, Part 2.
So, Dr. Das, I think it's fair to say in your line of work, like, you've seen some shit, basically, you know what I mean? And I'm, just listening to some of the stories that you gave. There was one in particular involving a young lady, I guess, who murdered her nephew through having, I guess, psychological episodes, I think you call them. Psychosis, right? Yeah, so talk to us about this occurrence.
Yeah, sure. So this, I talk about this quite a lot because it's such an emotional case for me, and it's also the first time that I gave evidence in a murder trial, so it's very educational for me at the time as well.
Right.
So it was 2014, I believe. There was a young girl, so I call her, in interviews I call her Yasmin, in my book I call her Yasmin.
Right.
That's not a real name, but basically the reason that it was so unusual was because she didn't have a background of any mental health problems.
I found that interesting as well, yeah.
Really unusual. Almost, I'd say more than 95% of my patients have some sort of psychiatric history before they commit serious violence, because it's kind of deteriorated over the years. So she didn't, no antisocial behaviour, never even got in trouble at school, never got detention, never used drugs and alcohol as far as we know. She's just a sort of quiet, meek girl. And she, as you say, she had a flash of psychosis. So the day that it happened wasn't the first sign. She had deteriorated over the space of about 2 or 3 weeks earlier. But her, what I call a prodrome, so it's like the warning sign of psychosis. It's not full-blown psychosis, but it's a bit of an oddness in feelings and interactions. So, for example, she was making these odd comments about seeing her soul up in the clouds, and she started listening to this weird chanting music instead of pop music, and she would like tell her family off for watching smut on TV, even though it was the normal sitcoms.
Smut would be like what, like exposed?
So she was insinuating that it was like really dirty sort of porn. Yeah, she didn't use those words, but she was saying that, and she was incorrect. It was just the normal stuff, like they're a family, so it was just like a sitcom. So in her mind, obviously, she was seeing things differently. Her perspective was changing compared to her normal self. Anyway, so that happened for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then as you say, she is absolutely tragic. She killed her nephew, so she was babysitting him. She smothered him with a pillow, fully believing that he had demons inside of him, and that she needed to do this to save his life or to stop him going from hell, and that she could reincarnate him. And she didn't try and hide it, because in her mind she hadn't done anything wrong. So her mother came home a few hours later, and she was like confused about why her mother was panicking, and then the mother obviously called the police. Police came, and again she wasn't like trying to deny it. She was like, I don't know what's wrong with you guys, I'm about to reincarnate him, and the full moon's coming up. So she genuinely believed it at the time. Obviously she got sent to prison on remand, and then I saw her at Holloway Prison on remand, and it was really hard to assess her because she was really guarded, and she said that she couldn't remember anything to do with what happened with her nephew, and she was sort of quite passive aggressive. So she was superficially polite, but she wasn't really answering my questions, which put me in a really awkward situation.
Because I didn't. Not to cut you off, but seeing her at Holloway Prison, whatever. How long after had she committed the offence did you go over there to try and assess her?
So I think in this case it was maybe a few weeks, 3 or 4 weeks.
Right, so and after the offence, and then
Yeah, 3 or 4 weeks after the offence, and then it took about another 3 or 4 weeks after I got a warrant from the Ministry of Justice to transfer her over to our ward, just because the waiting list was that long. And then once she was on the ward, she was again really guarded and really difficult to assess. She wasn't really saying anything, but she would let these odd comments kind of slip. Stuff like, she asked me to print out everything that you know about reincarnation. She asked me once. And then obviously I tried to explore what she meant by that, and then she shut down. So she was obviously having these really weird, delusional, religious thoughts, but she wouldn't tell us any of them. But anyway, so I gave evidence at the Old Bailey, and the prosecution wanted to give her life imprisonment a life sentence in prison, which I think would have been the wrong move.
Right.
What she did was obviously horrendous, but I think that she needs rehabilitation and treatment because she had a mental illness. I don't think she needed punishment indefinitely in prison. So I gave evidence, and the other thing that really stands out to me about this case was that the barrister, the opposing barrister, the CPS barrister, was really aggressive with me and tried to like undermine my credibility because I was a really junior doctor at the time. But now I've come to realise that's their job. That's what they have to do. That's how they sort of win their cases. But I wasn't expecting it at the time.
Yeah, so I mean, the reality should supersede anything else. I mean, if she's ill, then we don't need to go so hard trying to put her in jail. Before, I may have been the person to be like, nah, fuck that. You know what I mean? But obviously now, learning about these things more, I'm slightly noticing the patterns and noticing the trail of activity, if you like, through psychology a little bit.
Yeah, well, what she did wasn't like, what she did was horrific.
No
two ways about that. But it wasn't like malicious or purposeful. She literally didn't know what she was doing. And we know that because we medicated her. So the judge listened to my evidence, so she got a hospital order rather than a prison sentence. So she went back to that unit and she was there for several years. And we medicated her with antipsychotics. And then it took about 18 months before her beliefs assuaged, reduced. And then finally she realised what she did. So for well over a year, she didn't believe people that her nephew was dead. Even her own family. She thought that she'd reincarnated him. So then when she finally realised, as you'd expect, she got really depressed, and then so that was part of her therapy as well.
Crazy. And she managed to get discharged at some point, I guess.
She did, yeah. So she was in hospital for about 3 or 4 years altogether, and she got discharged. But then she's not just sort of left, she's still supervised on a regular basis, and she has to take her medication.
For sure.
If she doesn't, then she could relapse, and obviously she's potentially very dangerous.
Insane, man. Fucking crazy. And I guess there was another instance where I guess a man followed his wife, saw her at a bar, and I guess murdered her by shooting her with a shotgun, and then turning a gun on himself.
Yeah.
And blowing, I guess, 75% of his face off, but he survived, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me about that one.
You said all the best bits yourself. Yeah, that was another case that really stuck out for me in my career. It's interesting because it is also a murder case, a bit like Yasmin's, but it's the exact opposite. So this guy was fully responsible for his actions. So he was a farmer. Him and his wife had separated, but hadn't finally divorced. I think they were going through divorce proceedings at the time. And he was basically just jealous, so she moved on. She started a new relationship.
Right, so she already left him?
Yeah. They'd been apart for several months. But they lived in a small village, so everybody sort of knew everybody, and everybody knew what was going on. So he found out pretty quickly when she started a new relationship. And then he actually turned up. I think the wife and her wife's new partner went to a restaurant, and the farmer turned up drunk, kind of confronted them.
What, randomly or?
I think he must have known. I actually don't know. I don't know. I mean, like I said, it's a small village. There's only like 2 or 3 pubs, and the guy's an alcoholic, so it could have just been random.
By chance, yeah.
And he sort of confronted her, and then he got her new address. So she was like living in a rented place around the corner, and he got her new address, followed her home. She was with their son, so he had a shotgun, being a farmer, and she got out of the
that was
car.
Crazy. Yeah. So
and he shot her dead in the back in front of their son.
Crazy.
The son turned the gun around, tried to kill himself. As you say, blew the bottom half of his face off. Suicide didn't work. So when I saw him, it was good. He was in hospital with reconstructive surgery for months. So I saw him maybe about 3-4 months afterwards, and it was a really eerie assessment. He was paraplegic, so he could damage so many nerves in his brainstem. So he was like literally out in a wheelchair, had like this little hole in the middle of his face, and you saw these flaps of skin.
Crazy.
So it was just so surreal. And I don't know why, but one thing that really sticks out to me from this memory was that the flaps of skin were different colours. Like I'd expect it all to be the same, but they're all like different shades of pink, and you could see like the lines where the stitches were. They were different pinks, and it just really bothered me that the pinks weren't the same.
The pinks weren't the same.
But he couldn't speak, obviously, and he couldn't type. He couldn't speak, so he had to communicate through typing. So he had this like iPad. So I'd ask him a question, and he'd like tap the answer.
No way.
But he was a really slow typer because he's a farmer, right? So he probably doesn't need to use emails very much. So I'd ask him these questions, and I just remember thinking this is going to take so long because I'd ask him like a question, he'd type for ages, and he'd only written like 2 words. But to his credit, again, what he did was inexcusable. But he completely took responsibility. He didn't try and. So he was depressed. Before the killing, he did get antidepressants from his GP. There was a clear sort of medical trail of evidence that he was depressed. He was an alcoholic, and his drinking had escalated with the problems with his wife. But he said outright, like, I take full responsibility. I deserve to be in prison. I hate myself for doing it. I really regret it. I wish I was dead. I wanted to kill myself. Right. This is all jealousy. It's not to do with mental illness. So he basically said politely, "You're wasting your time coming here because there's no mental illness angle," which I agreed with. So it was really easy report to write.
So what did you do at that point? Just pack up and leave?
I did because I still have to do a report for the judge, so I have to make it look professional. But I think I made my conclusion within 5-10 minutes of speaking to him. But I still had to do a full report. Like asking about his history and his, like all his individual symptoms and blah blah blah. So I still had to do a full report, but it was just quite an easy report to write compared to Yasmin because it's clear that he has full criminal responsibility. Right. So I basically said to the judge in my report that there's no question of him being sectioned. If he does have mild depression, he could be treated with that in prison. And so he ended up getting a life sentence with 37 years.
Damn. Crazy. Now, as far as the courts and stuff, you've, I guess, been involved in over 500 cases, I believe.
Yeah.
But as far as like murder and stuff, there's not been a lot of them. Like I think you said about 10 or so.
Yeah. So whenever I go to the interviews, I'm doing lots of sort of podcasts. Everybody always wants to know about murders.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
People always ask me about serial killers or terrorists. But in reality, very few of my cases are actually murder, just because it's not that common an assault. Like when you look at the number of cases that go through a court, murder's probably less than 10%, probably about closer to 5% of the cases that come in. So I've seen, I'd say that's about right, about 10 murders altogether.
Yeah. So what would be like the majority type of case that you'd sort of be involved with?
It's usually some sort of low-level violence, because most of the people that I see have those things that we were talking about before, either hearing voices, telling them to hurt people, or delusions. And the delusions are usually the ones that I see, usually quite paranoid. So it's either people that they know somehow plotting against them. So just off the top of my head, I remember seeing somebody quite recently who's convinced that their landlord had and it's completely all false, but in their mind it was true, that the landlord was trying to poison them with putting like a carbon monoxide, like putting a contraption that would leak carbon monoxide.
That's mad specific though. Like.
Yeah. No, it is. They tend to be quite specific. I've seen somebody else who thought his neighbour was a paedophile. Again, it's completely not true. And so he attacked his neighbour quite viciously, like a brood handle. So it's usually violence, anything from like a low-level assault to actual bodily harm to grievous bodily harm. I see people wielding knives a fair amount, because when they're paranoid. And what's interesting is sometimes it's purely mental illness. So there's literally no reason for them to be paranoid, but they have everything I was talking about. They carry knives. Sometimes there's that, plus like they probably live in really rough areas. Like for example, I see lots of people who live in ganglands in South London. So it's actually sensible they carry a knife, because they've literally been in situations where
that soon, definitely.
So possession of knife is a very common thing that I see because people are paranoid.
Yeah. And obviously you're, as I said, the professional of professionals, right? So you're someone dotting the I's, crossing the T's, like nothing's really gonna fly over you. But do you get like people that try a thing where they're like, yo, Doc, like I'm crazy, like, you know what I mean? I see Tweety Bird from the Looney Tunes like every 2 seconds. Like, do they try swindle you? Like, have you come across that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I wouldn't say it's very common, but maybe once every 3 or 4 months, I see a patient who either completely fabricates mental illness, or more often has some sort of mental illness, but they're trying to exaggerate the symptoms.
Right.
And it's really easy to spot, and I'll tell you why. Firstly, because I'm not naive enough to just take them at face value. I always look for objective evidence. So I will look at, like, say it's a stabbing, for example. I look at the old CCTV, if it's available, witness statements for anybody that saw them, the police witness statements of the police that arrested them, the police transcripts, so when the police interview the defendant, which is usually within 24 hours of the crime, it's printed out and it's sent with the case paper, so I have access to all of this. So I'm looking for consistency of symptoms. So to take your example, if somebody says I'm seeing Tweety Pie every 2 seconds, but they look normal on the CCTV and they didn't mention it during their police interview, then I know that it's probably suspicious. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I look at how they've been since being arrested. So if they're on remand, which they usually are for something like that, then I would ask the prison officers or look at the prison notes. And again, sometimes they say, this person's been isolating in their cell, not making sense, then I think that there's probably something here. Sure. But more often than that, they've been completely normal according to prison records. According to the prison officers, they've been socialising, laughing. Yeah. So I know that there's a disconnect between what they're telling me and what they're like. And the final thing I'd say is that, from my experience, people that try and feign mental illness, they over-exaggerate. So think about it, if you really were seeing things you couldn't understand, and if you really were paranoid and you'd never met me before, then you're not going to open up to me.
Absolutely.
I'm just some random dude in a suit and a nice waistcoat. And you're not going to tell me your deepest paranoid thoughts, are you? So when people are really psychotic, I have to tease it out of them. Whereas when people are faking it, they'll tell me within minutes, like, Doctor, I'm hearing these voices.
Right.
Yeah, they try and over-egg it. It's too obvious.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that's pretty nuts, man. I mean, that's pretty common, I guess. If someone, they do a madness, they'll probably be like, yeah, man, I'm crazy, sort of thing. Yeah, I always imagine it that way.
And hats off for them for trying, and everybody
for
trying.
Sure,
but it's a lot easier.
Yeah, but not with you.
And the other thing I'd say is that when they try and fake mental illness, I think they get it off what they see on TV, and usually the depiction's not that realistic.
For sure.
So I know, not because I'm super clever, because I've seen thousands of psychotic patients. I know what it looks like, so I also know what it doesn't look like.
Definitely. I just want to quote you again. So you've made a previous mention about how there's a difference between a mental illness and a personality disorder. So yeah, please intrigue me. Like, I'm interested.
Enlighten you, okay, yeah, no problem. So, yeah, there's a big difference. A mental illness is a change in somebody's baseline state, and it's for a period of time. So you can be depressed for a period, you can be like manic, which is the opposite of depressed, for a period, you can be psychotic, everything we was talking about before, hearing voices, paranoid, for a period of time. But it's different from your normal you. And in theory, if you get the right medication, you can just wipe out those symptoms. I say in theory because occasionally you get people whose mental illnesses are so severe that medication doesn't work, or it takes years to work. Whereas a personality disorder is different. It's a lot more entrenched, so it's part of your natural makeup. It's not a period of you being different. It is actually you. It's like a series of character flaws. So personality disorders that I see, by far the most common is antisocial personality disorder. So that's when somebody naturally, their instincts are to be aggressive, impulsive. They don't care about the rights of the average person. They don't learn from their mistakes, and they don't care about the law. So these are your typical kind of career criminals, drug dealers, thugs.
Their personality disorder.
Yeah, their personality disorder. That's inbuilt. So no amount of medication is going to change that.
Yeah.
So you can, if they've got depression, for example, you can treat the depression, or if they've got drug and alcohol problems, you can treat that. You can give them therapy, but you can't change who they are as a core person. So we do see that, we do treat them in forensic psychiatry, but they're much, much harder to treat than a mental illness. But often my patients have both, so they can be psychotic and antisocial personality disorder as well.
That's right, interesting. So I guess with the mental illness side of things, I guess, as you said, the symptoms will be a lot more severe, I guess.
Yeah. Their functioning is usually a lot more affected. So if you've got a personality disorder, you've got problems getting on with people, and you might have problems holding down a job, but your day-to-day functioning is normal. Whereas if you've got severe mental illness, if you're actually hearing voices, then it's really hard to do many normal things like have a job.
For sure. And to expand on mental illnesses, we have, as you said, schizophrenia are these words, like schizophrenia, right? And I've seen you on your YouTube channel, and obviously if you don't know about Dr. Das, he's on YouTube as well, go check his channel out. You've gave a mention to Ronnie Cray, I guess, as far as this, him being a schizophrenic, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting again, because obviously him being so obviously well known and famous and stuff like that, him having that condition as well, and I guess manoeuvring through whatever he was doing with that condition is, as you said, it's pretty, it's going to be harmful, I guess.
Yeah.
To, I guess, the onlookers and everyone else involved, sort of thing.
Yeah. So I think Ronnie Cray is unique for a couple of reasons. Well, actually, the Cray twins themselves are unique because obviously you've got two genetically identical people, but one of them has schizophrenia and one of them doesn't. So that in itself is really unusual. And they were both violent and both got done for murder in the end. So what's interesting about that is that I think they're both antisocial, so they both have personality disorders, as we were talking about before.
You reckon?
But on top of that, Ronnie had schizophrenia as well, and he was seen as the more unhinged and the more paranoid, the more dangerous out of the two of them.
Definitely.
But what's really another thing that's unusual about him is that most people, when they're paranoid and they're psychotic and they have things like schizophrenia, they will really struggle to function in life because they don't trust people, they can be violent, they end up in prison, they end up in hospital. But he's unique in that his job is to be violent and paranoid. So because he's a gangster, I think actually, I don't know if it helped him, I don't know if that's the right word, but he certainly could carry on.
In some instances, I guess it probably would help him.
I suppose it depends. If he's like extra sensitive and he can spot somebody who's about to like stab him in the back or somehow manipulate him, then that would be helpful. But I think from what I know about him, he would sometimes get paranoid about things that actually weren't happening. So he would think that somebody's insulting him when they weren't, and he would lash out and be violent towards them. So I think it's helpful to a degree, but if you're too psychotic, then you end up attacking people for no reason. But I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that an average normal person, if you or I smack somebody in the face or punch somebody for looking at us the wrong way, then maybe we get away with it once, but pretty soon would be somebody would call the police and would be in prison or at least arrested within days. Whereas if you're Ronnie Cray and that's what you and your brother do anyway, because you're celebrity hard gangsters, then people aren't going to go to the police, so he can get away with it, I suppose. What I'm saying.
I mean, even the fashion in which he murdered, because with Ronnie Cray, he murdered George Cornell, who was a part of the Richardson's gang from South London, I believe. Yeah. Him going into the pub and just shooting matey in the head, like that's pretty. I don't want to say nuts, but that's like...
It's pretty gangster.
Yeah, well, it's gangster, but also at the time it's like, bro, like this guy he's a bit, that's a bit nuts. Like,
yeah, it's quite unhinged, isn't it? Yeah. So I wonder what that was. I wonder whether that was his psychosis or whether it's his personality, or maybe both.
I mean, like he just literally walked in. I think George Cornell said a couple of words, something like, "Oh, look who's here," sort of thing, and he just whipped it out and bang.
But the other thing I keep saying about how he's quite unique is that I wonder, and I think I talked about this in my video, whether his sexuality played into it, because this is back in the 70s, right? So obviously homosexuality was a lot less socially acceptable back then.
Yeah.
And he is this hard gangster image. So I wonder, this is a lot of speculation here, I don't really know by interviewing him myself, but I wonder whether he had this like chip on his shoulder to prove his masculinity because he was gay. So I believe that this guy, George Cornell, not that day that he got killed, but on a previous occasion had made a homophobic slur.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether that festered with him, especially with his paranoia and his schizophrenia. And he was like, he has slighted me. I'm already, because of my sexuality, people are already judging me and I need to be this hard gangster. So I wonder whether that kind of added to his callousness, basically.
And then when you compare that to his brother, Reggie, who killed Jack the Hat, that was a bit more, I guess, emotionally driven, because Jack the Hat pretty much mentioned his Reggie's late wife, I guess, Frances or whatever.
Yeah, and she committed suicide.
Yeah, and then he just basically was like sort of going in, and he was like, you know what, fuck it, pulled out the gun jammed, and he gets a knife, stabs him upteenth time sort of thing. So that murder, I guess, is a bit more emotional and less sort of the schizophrenic sort of thing involved. Sort of thing. Yeah.
So that just seems like somebody who's probably antisocial, who's got a lifetime of offending, so probably doesn't really care about the law, probably doesn't really care about the consequences that much. But I suppose it's understandable, like what his crime makes sense because he felt slighted.
Yeah.
Whereas Ronnie's, I suppose it makes sense to a degree, but it's also it's too sort of high risk and flippant.
100% for sure. And okay, so that's schizophrenia. Now, also a mental illness as well would be a psychopath.
That is a personality disorder, actually. Not mental illness.
Right. It's not mental illness.
So a psychopathy is all of the things I was talking about before about being antisocial. So just to quickly recap for your viewers, that's like being aggressive, impulsive, not caring about the rights of other people, not learning from your mistakes, all of those things, plus being really charming and deceitful and manipulative. So somebody who's antisocial, like your average sort of high-level drug dealer or a thug, isn't necessarily that charming. And they tend to live at the fringes of society, whereas somebody who's a psychopath is really good at fitting in. So everybody thinks they're normal, but they're really good at taking advantage of other people.
Have you seen the film Paid in Full?
Yeah, I think I have. Is that is it Wesley Snipes?
No, it's Wood Harris. It's Mekhi Phifer and the rapper Cameron.
Yeah, I have actually.
Are you familiar with the story at all?
Remind me. I have seen it, but it was a long time ago.
This is Harlem.
Yeah.
In the early 80s, I believe. You got AZ Faizan, who's played by Wood Harris. Wood Harris's character, his name's Ace Boogie in the film. Yeah. And then you got Cameron, who plays a guy called Alpo. They call him Rico in the film, right? So Alpo is the perfect example, in my opinion, of a psychopath. Yeah. As far as the explanation you gave in that video, like you said, being charming, there's one thing you said as well. They're quick to sort of drop their friends in a heartbeat just to sustain themselves, sort of thing. Because I don't know if you remember in the movie when he killed Rich Porter, like his best friend, like he killed him. If you remember that part.
I can't remember, no.
Yeah, so basically, just to sort of recap, Rich is a big drug dealer in Harlem. His little brother ends up getting kidnapped, Darnell Porter, and the people that kidnap him, they send him his little brother's finger in a McDonald's bag and a recording, like as an audio of them cutting the finger off while he's all screaming and shit. So it's crazy stuff sort of thing. So he goes over to Alpo and he's like, I've got this bunch of drugs, I need to get my little brother back there, slowly killing him, and then at some point then Alpo just fucking kills him at that point.
What, kills his friend who wants his help?
Yeah, okay. Like killed Rich Porter.
For money?
I mean, or his position, because Rich was the man. Like he was running sort of things, isn't it? He was the go-to guy, and he had it. And Alpo sort of got brought in through Rich, but Alpo is this psychopath. He's like, I'm trying to be that sort of guy, I guess, right?
Yeah. So I'm afraid I can't remember the details from the film. From what you're saying, it sounds exactly like a psychopath. So I suppose the difference between somebody who's just violent, because not everybody who's violent, even people who are very violent, are necessarily psychopaths. But somebody who's just violent versus a psychopath is that a violent person you'll know that there's something wrong about them, and they're always aggressive, and it's about their image intimidating people. Whereas a psychopath is sneakier than that. A psychopath you won't necessarily be watching out for that person because you think that they're a normal sort of friendly person. They might even be your friend, but when the time comes, they'll just happily stab you in the back or even take life. I mean,
he had no motive to kill Rich. Like there's nothing in it, sort of thing. Yeah. And he was at, like I'm talking about Rich, he was at a point in his life where he was so vulnerable, and you did that to him.
Yeah.
That's fucking nuts. I want to use that term. Something's clearly got to be wrong with this geezer, a little bit.
So I've worked with psychopaths, with like people that have been formally diagnosed with psychopathy in personality disorder units within secure units in these locked hospitals. And the one thing there's actually two things that really stand out working with psychopaths. Number one, they look so normal. So compared to the other people on the ward, some of them have been taking medications for decades. A lot of them are overweight, dribbling, that kind of thing, from the side effects of the medication.
Crazy.
Some of them dress quite street, whereas psychopaths...
Quite street?
Yeah. They're just sagging pants, baseball caps. Yeah. But psychopaths are not those things. Psychopaths dress actually pretty smart, and they blend in. And there's one person that I can think of specifically who eventually actually ran away from our unit. He was a formal psychopath, he'd been diagnosed with psychopathy.
Right.
And I actually thought he was a member of staff because he was so sort of eloquent, well-spoken, well-dressed. I wasn't wearing a suit or anything, but he was wearing like a shirt and trousers.
Yeah.
He's on a psychiatric ward. There's no reason for him to wear a shirt. Do you know what I mean? I didn't even realise he wasn't. For the first day, I thought he was a member of staff. That had just forgotten his ID. It was only later that I realised he was a patient. So that's one thing that really stands out is they fit in so well. Because they don't want to draw attention to themselves. They don't want to be somebody that's seen as trouble because they just want to get out of the unit as quick as possible. And number two, how quickly they can drop their friends. So when we've worked with psychopaths, and there's in these personality units, a bit like prison, I imagine. There's like hierarchies of these angry men that've got a history of violence. Sometimes they get on, sometimes they have beef, sometimes they have fights. But what I've noticed about psychopaths is they will easily switch alliance when they need to distance themselves from a friend. So, for example, I've seen this happen quite a few times. If occasionally people sneak in drugs to these units, as the same in prison, as the same as that happens in prison. So, if one person is suspected of having drugs and their leave is stopped, or they test positive on a drug test by one of us, one of the members of staff, the psychopath will just completely drop their friend, completely disassociate themselves, even if they've been mates for years, because their friendship means nothing to him. It's just an opportunity. He's just using him for whatever, for money or to get him to buy cigarettes and blah, blah, blah. And the second doesn't need him anymore, even though they seem to have been friends for years. He'll just drop him and won't speak to him because he doesn't want to be associated with that person.
Fucking nuts. Yeah, that's pretty intense.